Ethan Carter had always believed that silence was a kind of language, one that revealed truths people rarely dared to speak. The quiet, dense forest that surrounded the new research base felt like a continuation of that belief. It was peaceful, but it held secrets. When he and his partner Clara moved to the edge of the wildlife preserve, he thought it would be a fresh beginning, a chance to mend what routine and distance had quietly damaged between them. But beginnings, he was learning, had a way of testing what was already fragile. Clara noticed the shift before Ethan did. The way his attention drifted during breakfast, the way he stared out at the misty horizon longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to appear. She tried to fill the silence with conversation, stories about the house, the neighbors, the endless unpacking, but his responses came slower each day. He wasn't cold, just absent, like someone walking through FOGE.at the research facility. Ethan found himself absorbed in a new assignment, an environmental study focused on the migratory behavior of forest mammals. It was the kind of work that demanded patience and observation, both qualities he possessed in abundance. When the project coordinator introduced a new field assistant, a volunteer from an environmental NGO in Kenya, Ethan hardly looked up at first. But when Malik Kato entered the room, something about the man's calm presence caught his attention. Malik was unlike anyone Ethan had worked with before. He was confident but not loud, his movements deliberate, his smile easy yet restrained. There was a steadiness about him that seemed to quiet the noise around him. During the briefing, he listened more than he spoke, nodding thoughtfully as though every detail carried weight. When their eyes met briefly across the table, Ethan felt something unspoken pass between them, a faint recognition, not of familiarity, but of intrigue. Over the next week, their paths crossed often. Malik assisted with data collection, sometimes joining Ethan in the lab to review samples or note field results. Their conversations began formally, technical, precise, but gradually drifted into personal territory. Malik spoke of his homeland, of dry seasons and green valleys, of how nature taught him patience. Ethan, in turn, found himself sharing small details about his own life, his love for the rain, his unease with crowds, his habit of collecting old maps. Clara noticed that he returned home later each evening. When she asked if the workload was heavy, Ethan simply nodded, adding that Malik was efficient and that the team's progress depended on long hours. She smiled politely but watched his face as he spoke, sensing that something had changed beneath his calm surface. The first real sign came a week later, during a team meeting. The institute announced an upcoming field assessment, a 3-day survival and observation exercise deep inside the jungle. 2-person teams would venture out to test their endurance and record nocturnal animal activity. Ethan volunteered immediately, surprising even himself with how quickly he raised his hand. When the coordinator asked for his chosen partner, he said Malik's name without hesitation. Later that night, Clara asked why he hadn't picked one of his longtime colleagues. Ethan shrugged. Malik's reliable. He's good in the field, he said, though even to himself, the words felt rehearsed. She said nothing more, only reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Her touch was warm, familiar, yet something inside him stayed distant, unreachable. In the days leading up to the expedition, Ethan felt an unfamiliar restlessness. He told himself it was the anticipation of the fieldwork, the challenge of navigating wild terrain. But beneath that reasoning pulsed a quieter truth, curiosity. He wanted to understand Malik beyond the polite exchanges and professional boundaries. There was a depth to him, a quiet confidence that drew Ethan closer, not through words but through presence. The morning of departure arrived with a mist that hung low over the trees. Clara helped him pack, folding his clothes neatly, slipping a small note into the side pocket of his bag. "For when you can't sleep," she said with a faint smile. Ethan kissed her forehead, thanked her softly, and promised to call once they returned. She watched from the porch as he loaded his gear into the truck, her hand raised in a wave that lingered long after he disappeared down the dirt road. The drive to the jungle was long, winding through narrow paths and forgotten villages. Malik sat beside him, occasionally pointing out a tree species or the tracks of a wild animal in the dust. Their conversation was sparse but comfortable. There was a rhythm between them, built not from familiarity but from a shared understanding of solitude. By the time they reached the forest base, the sun had dipped low, staining the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They unloaded their supplies, checked their equipment, and set up camp by a small river clearing. The sound of flowing water mingled with the distant calls of unseen creatures. Malik gathered wood for the fire while Ethan assembled the tent, their movements wordless yet synchronized. As the flames rose, Malik sat across from Ethan, his face illuminated by the orange light. He began to speak about his childhood, the sound of drums on nights of celebration, the scent of rain on dry earth. His voice carried warmth, unhurried, almost melodic. Ethan listened, drawn in by the simple honesty of it. When Malik asked about his life, Ethan hesitated before answering. He spoke of his city, his studies, his relationship with Clara, but his words felt thin, as if describing someone else's existence. The night deepened, the forest alive with whispers. A silence stretched between them, neither heavy nor awkward, just present. Malik looked into the fire, then at Ethan. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we go far to find what we were afraid to see close to home." Ethan didn't reply. The words lingered in his mind long after Malik turned away. He thought of Clara, of their quiet dinners, their unspoken distance, and wondered what he was truly searching for in this place. The forest around them seemed to pulse with unseen life. Crickets hummed, the river murmured, and the fire crackled in small bursts. Ethan felt both alone and understood in a way he couldn't name. It wasn't attraction he felt, not yet, but recognition, as though Malik's presence mirrored something hidden within himself. When he finally lay down inside the tent, the night air cool against his skin, he could still hear Malik moving outside, humming a faint tune in his native tongue. The melody faded slowly, leaving Ethan awake with thoughts that refused to quiet. Tomorrow, they would begin their test, 3 days alone in the wilderness. But even now, Ethan sensed that what awaited them wasn't merely a test of survival. It would be something deeper, quieter, and far more revealing. That he closed his eyes, listening to the forest breathe. The silence, once familiar, now carried a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The morning after the storm was unnervingly still. The mountains wore a fresh layer of mist, and the air outside the cabin smelled clean, too clean, as though the night before had been washed away. Ethan woke to silence, broken only by the slow crackle of new firewood and the faint sound of water dripping from the roof. His head felt heavy, not from wine, but from everything that had gone unsaid. Caleb stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost casual, but something beneath it had changed. His voice when he spoke was soft, careful. "You sleep at all?" Ethan shook his head. "Barely." Caleb handed him a mug. "Yeah. Me neither." They sat across from each other, separated by the narrow table that suddenly felt like a chasm. The quiet wasn't comfortable this time. It was thick, weighted with what they hadn't done but almost had. Ethan stared into his cup, the rising steam blurring his reflection. He wanted to say something, apologize, explain, retreat, but no words fit. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "We should probably head back before the road's ice over." Ethan nodded, grateful for the practicality of the statement. "Yeah. Let's do that." They packed in silence. Every small sound, the zip of a bag, the creak of the floorboards, the closing of drawers, felt exaggerated, like punctuation in a conversation neither wanted to finish. When Caleb brushed past him to grab his jacket, Ethan's heart jumped despite himself. The nearness hurt more than the distance ever could. Before leaving, Ethan stepped outside for air. The sky was pale, the valley below hidden under slow-moving fog. He closed his eyes, letting the cold bite at his skin. He told himself this would fade, that time and reason would erase the sharpness of what had almost happened. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. Some moments refused to dissolve. Caleb came out behind him. "You ready?" Ethan nodded without turning around. "Yeah." The drive down the mountain was quiet. The winding roads felt endless, and each curve brought a new kind of tension, the kind that comes from knowing silence is safer than truth. Caleb focused on the road, his jaw tight, knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Ethan watched the landscape blur past, trees melting into shades of gray and green. He wanted to say something that could make the air lighter, but everything that came to mind felt dishonest. Halfway down, Caleb finally spoke. "You don't have to hate me for last night." Ethan turned to him. "I don't." Caleb's eyes stayed on the road. "Then what do you feel?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Confused. Guilty. Maybe both." "About me?" "About everything." Caleb gave a faint nod, almost to himself. "I didn't plan it, you know." "I know." Ethan paused. "That doesn't make it easier." They drove the rest of the way in silence. By the time they reached the highway, the sun had climbed above the trees, melting what little snow remained. The world looked ordinary again, and that felt like a lie. When Caleb dropped him off at his apartment, he didn't kill the engine. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't move to leave. For a long moment, they sat in stillness. Caleb broke it first. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "You too." He stepped out, closed the door, and stood on the curb as the truck pulled away. The sound of its tires faded into city noise until it was gone entirely. For the first time in days, Ethan felt utterly alone. Inside, Ryan was home early. He looked up from the couch, smiling with that easy familiarity Ethan had always found comforting. "Hey, you're back sooner than I thought. How was it?" Ethan managed a smile. "Peaceful." Ryan stood, stretching, then crossed over to hug him. "You needed it." Ethan let himself be held, but it felt strange, like fitting into a shape that no longer matched perfectly. Ryan smelled like coffee and cedar soap, the same as always. Nothing had changed here, and that was the problem. As the evening went on, Ryan talked about work, about a project deadline, about weekend plans. Ethan listened, nodding at the right moments, pretending everything was fine. But part of him still lingered in that cabin, by the fire, in the sound of rain, in Caleb's voice whispering truths neither could bear to hold. Later that night, while Ryan slept, Ethan sat by the window with his phone. One unread message glowed on the screen. "Caleb, I didn't plan it. But I don't regret feeling something real." Ethan's thumb hovered over the delete button. He didn't reply. Instead, he locked the screen and set the phone face down. But the words stayed, echoing like a heartbeat. He stared out at the city lights scattered across the dark. It was strange how easily life resumed, how routine could disguise turmoil. Yet inside, a quiet storm still moved. Guilt pressed at him, but beneath it lay something harder to name, a longing not for what happened, but for what it revealed. He wondered what it said about him, that a single weekend could shake years of certainty. That a glance, a touch, a near mistake could make him question what he thought he knew about love and loyalty. By midnight, the room had gone completely still. Ryan shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Ethan watched him, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the trust in his unguarded face. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, but couldn't. The space felt sacred now, something he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. When dawn approached, pale and thin, Ethan still hadn't slept. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window as the first light touched the skyline. His reflection looked older, quieter, changed in ways no one would notice. He thought of the mountains, of how they seemed eternal from afar, but up close, every surface told a story of erosion, of weather, of time reshaping even the strongest stone. Maybe people weren't so different. Caleb would fade, he told himself. The memory would dull, the guilt would soften. But part of him knew better. Some stories don't end, they just become quieter versions of themselves. hidden in the folds of ordinary life. Ethan took a slow breath and whispered to the empty room, "The mountains keep secrets." Then, almost to himself, softer still, "So do I." He set the mug down, straightened his posture, and turned toward the day waiting for him, but as the sunlight broke across the room, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted for good, and that the silence he carried from that cabin would follow him long after everything else had been forgotten. The following evening, Ryan called again. His voice was calmer this time, but beneath it I could sense something raw, something unsettled that hadn't healed overnight. "Could you come over for a bit?" he asked. "I just don't want to be alone tonight." For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me knew the air between us had changed. Still, I said yes. Maybe I wanted to believe I was strong enough to face that shift without consequence. When I arrived, the apartment was dimly lit, the storm replaced by a soft drizzle tapping against the windows. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, a poor disguise for the lingering tension that hung in the air. Ryan was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, eyes heavy with exhaustion, couldn't sleep. I asked that he gave a faint laugh. "Barely. I kept thinking about last night." "I didn't say anything wrong, did I?" "Of course not," I said, though the question itself carried too much weight. "You were just being honest." He leaned against the counter, studying me. "You're the only person I can be honest with anymore." The statement hit me harder than it should have. I busied myself with my cup, pretending I didn't feel the pull behind those words. I told myself this was what friends did: show up, listen, keep boundaries. But I could already feel the edge of something more, creeping quietly into the spaces between our sentences that we moved to the living room. Ryan talked about his marriage again, but this time his voice held less anger and more resignation. "I don't even recognize who we are anymore," he said. "Liam used to make me feel grounded. Now I feel invisible." "Maybe he's just distracted," I suggested, though the words felt hollow. "Work, stress, it's not that," Ryan interrupted softly. "It's me. I've changed. I'm not who he married." He stared down at his hands, the knuckles pale from tension. I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but something stopped me. I'd seen how easily sympathy could turn into something else. "Ryan," I said carefully, "you're allowed to change. That's what people do. Maybe Liam just doesn't know how to meet you where you are right now." Ryan looked up, eyes tired but searching. "And what if no one does?" His question lingered in the air, fragile and dangerous. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned my gaze toward the rain outside, hoping silence would say enough. Time passed slowly after that. We sat close, the only sound the faint hum of the city below. I could feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder, the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was a kind of intimacy that didn't need words, and that made it far more dangerous. At one point, Ryan stood to put on music. The soft crackle of an old jazz record filled the room, low and haunting. He poured 2 more cups of coffee, then sat back down beside me, closer than before. "You always know how to make things feel normal," he said. That I smiled weakly. "I think that's my problem. I make things too easy for people." He tilted his head. "That's not a problem. That's who you are." There was something in his tone that made my chest tighten. I met his gaze, and for the first time, neither of us looked away. It wasn't a romantic moment, at least not in the traditional sense. It was quieter than that, deeper, like 2 people teetering on the edge of a truth they didn't want to admit. Ryan reached out then, fingers brushing the back of my hand. The touch was light, almost hesitant. I didn't pull away. I should have, but I didn't. The silence between us grew heavier, until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. "Ethan," he whispered, "why does it feel like you understand me more than he ever did?" The question broke something in me. I wanted to tell him it wasn't true, that he was only seeing what he wanted to see, but instead, I said nothing. Because in that moment, I did understand him. Too well. His hand lingered on mine, and I could feel the tremor in his touch. Then, almost instinctively, he leaned forward. Not enough to close the distance, just enough to blur it. My pulse quickened. The world outside seemed to fade until there was only him, his voice, his warmth, the storm's soft echo beyond the glass that I stood abruptly, stepping back as if the air had become too thick to breathe. Ryan, we can't, he looked up, startled, then ashamed. I know, he said quietly. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, it's okay, I interrupted, my voice unsteady. You're just going through a lot. He nodded, eyes lowered, and the silence that followed was unbearable. Minutes passed before he spoke again. I didn't mean to make things weird. You didn't, I lied. We're fine. But we weren't fine. Something irreversible had shifted. I could feel it in the way his eyes avoided mine, in the way my heart refused to slow down. The safety of our friendship had cracked open, and what spilled through that fracture was something neither of us could name without breaking everything else. When Ryan's phone began to vibrate on the coffee table, the sound made both of us flinch. I glanced at the screen, Liam. The name glowed like a warning. Ryan didn't move to answer. He just stared at it, the muscles in his jaw tightening. The ringing stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. That he exhaled shakily. I can't talk to him right now. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The guilt in his voice, the pain in his eyes, it all tangled with something selfish inside me. Part of me wanted to tell him to call, to fix things. Another part wanted him to stay in this moment, here, where I could still be the one he turned to. He stood then, walking toward the window. You should probably go, he said after a long pause. His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm behind it. Ryan, please, he said softly. I just need a little time to think. I hesitated, wanting to say something that could undo what had just happened. But there were no words that could make it right. So I nodded, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. Just as I opened it, he said my name. I turned, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other. Whatever we had been before, friends, brothers, something safe, it wasn't that anymore. I'm sorry, he said again, almost a whisper. That I gave a small nod. Me too. Then I left, closing the door behind me. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the scent of it, clean, heavy, impossible to ignore. I stood in the hallway for a long time, my reflection dimly visible in the elevator's metal door. That's when I realized something I hadn't wanted to face. What happened between Ryan and me hadn't been an accident of circumstance. It had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the right moment to reveal itself, and now that it had, there was no turning back.